Hi, everybody. It's Jay, and I am back in the booth with you for another sneak peek video preview for this week's new release here on Say with Jay. Our new release this week is the fifth book in Jessie Gussman's Sweetwater Ranch Western Cowboy romance series, The Cowboy's Convenient Marriage. Now, I've got more on the book and a sample for you in just a bit, but first, I wanted to share something that I thought was kind of cool, or kind of cool to me anyway. I've mentioned here before that one of my New Year's resolutions was to read the Bible cover to cover, something I've never done before. And this week, I've been reading in the book of Judges. It just so happened that the very day I was reading chapter 7 in a completely unrelated devotion that I was also reading, the verse that they referenced was Judges 7:7. Now, there are 31,102 verses in the King James Version of the Bible. So, what are the odds of that happening? For you non-math majors, it's 1 in 31,102. But that's really neither here nor there. The point is that I figured, you know what? I'm going to go back and read that again because that could kind of be a sign. And that's the story of Gideon, who is, let's say, a very reluctant warrior that God has chosen to deliver Israel from the Midianites. Now, fun trivia fact, the book of Judges is essentially a repeating story of Israel repeatedly turning away from God, falling into idolatry and worse, God allowing Israel to be conquered and coming under the submission of other nations, the Israelites suffering and then realizing their error and repenting their ways and calling for God to help, and God raising up a deliverer who then delivers Israel from their oppressors. And the trivia part of that, by the way, is the deliverer, or the Hebrew word for this deliverer, roughly translated in English, is judge, thus the name of the book. But back to Gideon. As I said, Gideon was rather reluctant to take up the role that God had for him, and in fact, asked God for not one, but 2 miracles to prove that he was the right guy. God graciously obliged, and so Gideon raised an army of 32,000 men. And when they were on the verge of marching on the Midianite camp, God stopped him and said, no, I'm not going to let you do this, because if you march with these 32,000 men, Israel will believe they did this of their own strength. And I want them to know that it's God's strength that saved them. So he had Gideon send away all but 300 men. And these 300 men, through God's power, successfully ousted the Midianites and defeated them. And, it made me think, how often are we faced with situations in our everyday lives where we want to have every last detailed plan, or we hesitate to do something because we don't think we're good enough, and we want to have, well, the equivalent of our own 32,000-man army, rather than trusting that God has a plan for us and can take care of us. But here's the thing. Remember, God is always with us, and if he can defeat a massive army with just 300 men, imagine what he can do for us if we'll just trust Him. That leads me into our story this week, because Remington Martinez and Elaine Andersen are two people with challenges in their lives and difficult situations that they're facing. Elaine is a single mother of 4 who's on the verge of losing her ranch after her husband has left her, for her younger sister, no less. Remington Martinez is a retired champion bull rider who is both physically and emotionally broken and needs to find a place to heal and to find himself. It's a simple business transaction, or it starts that way. They get married, Elaine saves her ranch, Rem gets a ranch. But can they, beyond their own plans, trust God's bigger plan and find trust and family and maybe love? You know you're going to have to come back this Friday to find out. But for now, here's a sample of The Cowboy's Convenient Marriage. Hope you enjoy it, then come back this Friday for the full release here on Say with Jay.
While Elaine put the kids to bed, Rem shoved his coat on and went outside. He'd never been upstairs in the house, and although tonight seemed like a good time to start helping with the bedtime routine, he didn't volunteer, and she didn't ask him to, of course. The big round thermometer on the porch declared that it was well below 0, and the snow squeaked under his boots as he walked toward the barn. He must be getting used to the cold, since he felt fine with nothing but his coat on. Funny, because the cold was the thing that bothered him the most when he came. He didn't really have a destination in mind, just needed to get out for a few minutes, and ended up in the barn by the horses' stalls. Midnight. That was the name of the old quarter horse in the stall. He snorted, and hay rustled as the big body shifted, coming to the stall's gate and nuzzling Rem's coat. "Didn't think to bring you anything, old boy," Rem said as he scratched the ears in the dark. He'd spent enough time in the barn that he was comfortable with no lights. The scent of hay and musky animals, the sound of big bodies shifting, and even the scratch of mice by the feed bin were comforting and familiar. Unlike the odd warmth and eddy in his chest that made him feel like he was underwater or too close to the fire. There was no fire and no water, but he couldn't shake the odd feeling. Partly brought on from playing with the kids, which he'd never done before, the strength of the feeling was caused by more than that. He hadn't expected to like Elaine. No, that wasn't quite right. He completely expected to like Elaine, at least enough to get along with her. Figured they'd be friends. Figured eventually they'd share a room and a bed once she'd gotten comfortable with him. That's what married people did, after all. He hadn't expected to be attracted to her, to feel hot and cold when she was around and have his fingertips tingle with the need to touch her when she was close. Like she'd been tonight. How could he not be aware of every move she made? Her smile, the flow of her hair over her shoulder, the arch of her foot. He'd moved, taking them both down to the twister mat on purpose because he couldn't stand having her so close and not touching her. Maybe she knew what he'd done. Maybe that was why she had such a hard time looking him in the eye before she'd left the room. She'd seemed a little shocked, though, at their position when the kids had quit wrestling. How could he not wrap his arm around her and tuck her into the curve of his body? He moved his hand down Midnight's furry neck, scratching under the mane. He wanted to protect her and provide for her, ease her burden and take care of her. He'd wanted that from almost the moment he met her. He understood those feelings and figured that's just the way he was. He'd want that with anyone, probably. But this was more. It had nothing to do with her struggles and everything to do with how she handled them. She looked delicate, but had that backbone of steel. It wasn't inflexible, though, because she bent gracefully to his will and was somehow able to tell when it was necessary for her to do so and when she could stand up to him. His phone buzzed, and he welcomed the distraction. He had no idea why he couldn't stop thinking about his wife, but he needed to get her out of his mind. The kind of feelings that were growing inside of him were not appropriate for the kind of marriage they had. They were dangerous as well, because they would give her the power to hurt him, like Olivia. He glanced at his phone before swiping. Ford. "Hey, man," he said, holding it to his ear while continuing to stroke Midnight. "Rem, how's married life?" "Guess I could ask you the same question." "It's the best thing that's ever happened to me." The slightly amazed tone in Ford's voice could leave no doubt as to his sincerity. "Good to hear. I'm happy for you."
Hi, this is Jay, and thanks for listening. If you're ready for another great audiobook, here's one we think you might like. Or check out the playlist with all our latest releases. Don't forget to subscribe to Say with Jay, give this video a thumbs up, and tell us what you liked in the comments.